Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for our sixth teach-in. My name is Olivia McDonald Major, and I am in my final year of an honors Bachelor of Arts degree in history and am an organizer with students supporting UMFA. Before I pass it over to Dr. Greg Bach to introduce today's panel, I will read students supporting UMFA's land acknowledgement. The University of Manitoba, where many of us gather here today to study, is a colonial structure built on traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations, who are the first and rightful inhabitants of these lands. The water that sustains us here comes from Shoal Lake. As the first university to be established in what is now called Western Canada, we recognize that the university's historical and ongoing role to enable the violence and oppression Indigenous people have suffered and continue to suffer. Our programs privilege and perpetuate colonial ideologies that value Eurocentric forms and erase Indigenous knowledge systems, independent of and existing prior to dominant Western knowledge. Our academic relationships are embedded with power relationships structured by colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. It is through the university's ongoing and growing relationship with the neoliberal state and global capitalism that colonization and violence against Indigenous people is inseparable from the academic institution that is now called the University of Manitoba. And now I pass it over to Dr. Bach.
Thank you for the land acknowledgement, Olivia, and welcome everybody to today's teach-in. My name is Greg Bach, and I'm an associate professor of history. I've been teaching at the University of Manitoba since 2011. Prior to that, I was a digital archivist with Library and Archives Canada. When I'm not on strike, I teach courses in archival studies or in the history of digital culture. I was teaching in both areas when our term was interrupted. So I would like to say a cheerful hello to any students out there, either from History 4000, Introduction to Archival Studies, or History 1260, the History of Interactive Computing. I hope we get back to the classroom soon. As my picket sign says, I'd rather be teaching. But since the administration won't negotiate a fair deal with my union, here we are. I'd like to thank students supporting UMFA, first of all, for their support of our fight for a fair deal, and also for the opportunity to do a little teaching today through this teach-in as part of our strike effort. I'm happy to say that I'm joined by two other UMFA members and a student from the Archival Studies program. In case you don't already know, the UMFA collective agreement includes librarians and archivists, as well as professors. Today, you'll get to hear from one professor, me, two archivists, and a student. We are here because we can't be doing what we'd rather be doing, working as archivists, studying and teaching. And I know that all of you would rather be earning your degrees. Your support for our collective bargaining process is very much appreciated by me and by every other UMFA member on strike. It is unfortunate that we have to go through this in order to get a fair deal. Your support is an incredibly important part of this process. One of the pleasures of the strike for faculty is that we get to meet colleagues on the picket line that we might not otherwise meet and to talk to them about their research and teaching. I hope that today's teach-in will give you a similar experience as you get to learn a little bit about a field and a profession that you might not otherwise hear too much about, the field of archival studies and the professional work of archivists. Today's teach-in explores connections between archives, rights, and resistance. Archives might not be the first thing you think of when you encounter injustice. If so, I hope that today's session might help you to understand the crucial role that archives and archivists play in uncovering injustice, documenting harms, and seeking redress. Our panel will approach this topic from a variety of perspectives. I'll introduce our speakers now, and then they'll each give their talk. So our first speaker will be Heather Bidzinski. Heather is the head of the University of Manitoba Archives and Special Collections. A graduate of the University of Manitoba for her BA and her MA in Archival Studies, Heather has over 15 years experience in archives, records management, and collections care. She co-founded the Oral History program at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and is actively engaged in the archival community through committee and board work for the Association of Canadian Archivists, the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, and the Association for Manitoba Archives. She is passionate about breaking down systemic barriers to access, and this inspires her journey to incorporate traditional knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing and being into current archival practice. Heather's talk will identify connections between archives and human rights as she explores reparation, remembering, and response. Our second speaker is Scott Price. Scott has a BA Honors in History from the University of Winnipeg and is currently a master's student in the Archival Studies stream of the Joint Master's Program in History at the University of Manitoba and the University of Winnipeg. Scott's research interests include Canadian labor history, oral history, and archival theory. Scott has worked with UFCW Local 832 on a long-term oral history project and is currently completing his internship at the University of Winnipeg Archives, processing the personal records of Paul Moist, a former national president of CUPE. Scott will speak about the importance of labor unions creating their own archives and the importance of oral history for Canadian labor history. Our third speaker is Jesse Boiteau. Jesse is the senior archivist at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation and a member of the Métis Nation. He completed his master's in archival studies at the University of Manitoba in 2017, focusing on intersections between Western archival theory and practice and Indigenous notions of archives and memory, to shed light on how the NCTR can accommodate and blend multiple viewpoints in its processes. Jesse's talk will address individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples to accessing records and history in colonial archives, paying particular attention to Indigenous resistance in archives as researchers and, importantly, as archival staff. I will round out the panel with a few comments on archivists as activists who are called on, now more than ever, to advance social justice, decolonization, and reconciliation through their work. Today's archivists couldn't be further from the popular stereotype of the archivist as a passive collector of random stuff. As you will see from our panel, archivists working today, archivists like Heather, Scott, and Jesse, are actively creating the archives that are needed to preserve rights and uncover and address all manner of injustice in our society. And with that, I turn things over to Heather.
Thanks, Greg. I'm really happy to be here today, and I'd like to echo Greg's comments on our thanks to the students supporting UMFA for the opportunity to do a little bit of what we love. So I'm just going to share my screen here quickly. All right, so what I would like to talk about today is a couple of human rights atrocities and how archives plays a role in remembering them. So I'm going to try to lay out three really brief history lessons and talk about the human rights violations in three cases and how archives plays a role in those. So the human rights violations that we're going to address today are the Holocaust, the Guatemalan internal civil war, and the South African apartheid area and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'll give you a brief overview of a history of each of these and then do a little bit of a tie-in with archives and how the records are related.
Heather,
before we get into those three.
I'm not seeing your PowerPoint.
Oh, no, that's not good. So you're just seeing a talking head. How about now?
Yep.
Yay! All right, I'm out of practice with my Zoom here. All right, so advance my slides. Here we go. So before we get into the actual human rights violations themselves, a little bit about the records created in the course of those human rights violations and who creates those records. There's sort of four players involved in creating records during the course of a human rights violation. We have the enablers or enactors, who are usually government bodies or ruling bodies. We have the perpetrators, who are usually on the front lines actually committing the acts of violence or atrocity. We have the victims and family members or survivors of those victims. And we have witnesses like journals and international watch guards. The different types of records that we might see in the course of a human rights violations are laws, regulations, reports, past systems and documents, fingerprints or identification registers, photographs, lists, diaries, journals, notebooks, correspondence, written and oral testimony, and responsive records. So that is people responding to human rights violations through the creation of art, music, or poetry. These records can be used for remembrance, reparation, criminal prosecution, reconciliation, amplifying missing voices in the historical record, transitional justice, and healing. The first human rights violation that we'll be talking about is the Holocaust. And for the most part, these three violations are mass atrocity types or genocide-based human rights situations. So the Holocaust, your history lesson isn't going to be so much details about the Holocaust, but some of the things that came out of the Holocaust. So if many of you may not know that the Holocaust actually instigated the drafting and signing of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And a gentleman by the name of Raphael Lemkin was so disturbed by what he saw during the Holocaust that he created a new word for what was happening. And that's how the word genocide came about. You may have heard of Lemkin's definitions of genocide. And the Holocaust also instigated the first sitting of an international criminal court, which we know as the Nuremberg trials. One of the most interesting or most popular or well-known archival records that came out of the Holocaust was the Diary of a Young Girl. It's a rather inconspicuous archival record when taken out of context, but the Diary of Anne Frank provided for people, for the general population, a way to understand what was happening during the Holocaust. That was a time before mass media and before the internet, and through the translation of Anne Frank's diary into 70 languages and the creation of multiple editions, a lot of the broader population got to understand what was happening in the world at the time. So Anne Frank's diary created a number of offshoots like musicals and plays, many published editions and movies. And through these publications of this one archival record, people came to understand what was happening. One of the interesting things with Anne Frank's diary is there's actually two official versions of it. In the first version, Anne was very open about things like conflicts with her mother and a relationship or feelings she had for somebody that they shared their secret annex with. And she also talked about really personal things like her sexuality and things like that. And in the second version of her diary, we see that she's self-censored a little bit. Anne was somebody who wanted to become a writer. And so the second version of her diary not only had self-censorship, but there's a lot of polishing of the sentence structure and the way she was expressing things. So it's interesting because it shows us how she was developing as a writer, but it's also self-censorship in an archival record. So there's some things that you could really unpack there if you had longer than 10 or 15 minutes to talk about it. Anne Frank's diary was authenticated through forensic analysis and analyzing the chain of custody. And there are a number of people or different groups that actually challenged the veracity of this diary, but they tended to be Holocaust deniers and people that didn't really believe in a lot of the things that were happening. So her diaries and all of her works have been verified through forensic analysis. Another single archival document that ended up being made into a movie was Schindler's List. And this was another sort of inconspicuous document that, taken out of the context of what was happening at the time, it was a list of names and it wouldn't have been thought to have been that important. But of course, the list that Schindler made ended up saving over 1,200 lives during the Holocaust. And Schindler was in a position of power. He had a factory that was deemed essential to the war effort. And through that, he was able to create these lists and often fabricated the qualifications of his Jewish employees in order to have them exempted from being carried off in the trains. So those are two really well-known examples of how an archival record can play a huge role in in documenting and developing understanding, but also how the fabrication or manipulation of an archival record can end up being used as a piece of activism. So that's a photo of Schindler in his factory. The second situation I want to address is the Guatemalan Civil War, and that happened from about 1960 to 1996. This is something that's maybe not as well known as the Holocaust. In this little history lesson, I'm going to talk to you about the violence that happens in Guatemala. It is actually one of the most violent nations in Latin America, and is second only to Colombia for the number of human rights violations that it enacts. In 1960, that sort of marks the beginning of this internal civil war that occurred because of an uprising against the military dictatorship that was in power at the time. The National Police was probably the most influential arm of the government at the time, and they targeted rural civilians, largely Indigenous people, in response to this uprising. And over the course of the 35-year civil war, over 200,000 people were killed or disappeared. And how are you asking now? I'm sure. How are archives tied to this? So in 2005, a tremendous archive of the National Police was discovered by chance when a human rights group was investigating complaints about unsafe munition storage. And upon entering a former Guatemalan police munitions depot, they discovered over 80,000 documents, and they were in various states of disrepair. But upon further investigation, they discovered that this archive was actually documenting some of the actions against these disappeared. So a group was brought in to assess the documents, and one of the figures, Trudy Heskamp-Peterson, who was a former chief of government records in the US, came and did an assessment of these records, and it was determined that these were important records that needed to be restored and rescued. And at the end of the day, they filled this huge gap in searching for justice. They filled a silence that was being stonewalled, that the people were being stonewalled by the government. And so when the government was asked about these things, they sort of remained silent on all issues, but in analyzing the records, they were able to pull out the threads of justice and trace some of the actions against these people. Kate Doyle has written extensively on her work with the National Police Archives, and she talks about the first day that she entered this facility with her fellow archivists and activists. And she talks about uncovering cabinets labeled assassination, disappeared, and homicides, and folders labeled with the names of people that were internationally known victims of political murder. I think one of the most interesting things about this whole scenario is the importance of archival theory being applied in order to render these archives meaningful for the rest of society, and also so that they could be used in the prosecution of criminals. When it was first discovered that these records had information about people that had been missing or disappeared or murdered, a lot of the families were clamoring to gain the information that these records held. And there was an initial thought to just get these records into chronological order so everybody could find who they were looking for. And Trudy Peterson came in and said, no, it's really important that we maintain the original order of these records so that we can pull out the threads of what was happening at the time. By following the clues left by the records, they were able to identify files that were kept on each of these people and trace it back through the actions that were being taken against these political prisoners by the government. So they learned the language of the records really, and looked at file numbers and stamps and different colored copies in order to follow the thread through all of the records and the ledgers and the charges that were laid against these people. And the original order was the key to unraveling these stories. And also the archival organization and the chain of custody allowed people to use these records in criminal prosecutions. And it was the only way to trace the actions of the national police. When the peace accords of 1996 were established, the national police of Guatemala were disbanded because they were so intertwined with the action and the human rights atrocities that were occurring in Guatemala. So with the help of archivists, this group of human rights activists in Guatemala was able to organize the records, start restoring them, put order to them, and digitize them so that they could be accessed in the future. Here's a couple photos of some of the archivists in action there. The final human rights violation that I wanted to address is the apartheid era in South Africa. This is another one where people are probably familiar with the basics, but just an overview of what was happening. Apartheid is actually the Afrikaner word for apartness. And apartheid has its roots in early legislation from the 20th century, the 1913 Land Act, which started segregating Black South Africans from their white counterparts. The Afrikaner National Party, which was elected in 1948, really entrenched apartheid in South Africa, and they began enacting laws that physically separated, that made it illegal for Blacks and whites to have relationships, and classified people into three groups. You were either white, non-white, that is Black, South African, or mixed, and those were usually, colored, and that was mixed relationships. Of course, the South Africans started resisting all of the segregation and the repression that was happening. And what started as peaceful resistance ended up in violent outbreaks. The massacre of Sharpeville in 1960 and Soweto uprisings in 1976. And of course, Mandela was in prison during this time. After increasing pressure from the international community, the president stepped down in 1990 and was replaced by de Klerk, who freed Nelson Mandela from prison. Mandela became president, and in 1995, the TRC was established. So archival records played a huge part in establishing apartheid because of the laws that were enacted. And some of the records that exist today are signage and passbooks. And of course, the records of Mandela himself. So the tie to archives here is significantly Vern Harris and his role in the TRC. So Vern Harris is a South African archivist. He worked for the National Archives of South Africa from 81 until 2001. And particularly, he was with the Records Management Division from 88 till 93. This is important because the freedom of South Africa came in that era. He was also the director of the South African History Archives and Nelson Mandela Foundation, and he was Mandela's personal archivist from 2004 to 2013. So Vern Harris was an archivist during the transition from apartheid to democracy, and he refers to himself as a memory bandit. And it's interesting because he talks about having to understand which records to steal in order to make them part of the public domain and public memory. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa is really an archival intervention. And in the introduction, you can see that they speak to the loss or the elimination of thousands of voices. And one of the key pieces of apartheid was the mass destruction of government records on the eve of South Africa's freedom. Vern Harris himself was present as those records were being ordered to be destroyed, and he took part in trying to prevent some of that destruction from happening. the TRC investigation focused largely on this destruction of records, and it's described in the reports as a large-scale systemic sanitation of official memory resources authorized by the highest levels of government. So these were the sort of the darkest secrets of apartheid. And in looking at the records of the TRC, you can see the focus of archives because of the organization of the information itself. And I think that the key or the key connections between archives and the TRC are not only the looking into the destruction of the records themselves, but the oral testimony that happened near the end of the TRC. So there's quite a connection there. And if you look through the volumes of the TRC report, you can see the focus that was placed upon the archival record and the destruction of the record and the management of the information during the TRC. So those are sort of the three high-level human rights atrocities and their connections to archives. And to sort of wrap it up and bring it home, I thought I'd just share with you a little bit about the human rights records that are at the Archives and Special Collections at the University of Manitoba. So here's a little bit of a walkthrough of our site, and you can see we do have access to our records by subject, and this is an archival intervention. Those of you that are familiar with archival records and their organization will know that archival records aren't typically described by subject, and you can see looking at the collection names that a lot of the human rights content isn't evident by the name of the collection or the fond. So archivists have gone through our collections and identified where there are records related to human rights within our archival fond. We've got everything from Louis Riel to feminist history, and we've got records of the Winnipeg General Strike, some Aboriginal or Indigenous rights as well. And one of the most prominent collections that we have is the Manitoba Gay and Lesbian Archives, which came fairly recently in our history. And then this is just a shot of the archival database record that we have describing those records. So I think I'm pretty darn close to my 15 minutes or a little bit over. And so I'm going to stop right there and hand it over to Scott.
Thank you. Can people hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Heather. That was really interesting. I didn't actually, some of the fonds at the collections at the University of Manitoba, I kind of forgot about all the different stuff that's in there, actually. Right, so a bit of a background to me before going into archival studies. I worked a lot with oral history and union history, and I was a part of working for UFCW Local 832, that's United Food and Commercial Workers, on a long-term sort of oral history project that will be turned into a book, hopefully fairly soon. That is a sort of a collection of the oral histories and kind of laying out somewhat of a history of the Union, although it's sort of a complicated organization because of mergers that have happened over the years and kind of tracing all that. So that's sort of where I kind of got my interest in archival studies. And so I kind of come at it from labor history and oral history, and then that's sort of what I've been focusing on for my thesis, which is sort of about labor records in Canada and how do we properly document labor unions in Canada and sort of where we're at right now. So I'll go into that and sort of the issues around Canadian labor history in terms of what's in collections right now. So if you kind of look through collections, there certainly is Canadian labor history in Canada in various places. Obviously, Library Archives of Canada will have, LAC will have. There's certain places in regional depositories or collections like at universities, and obviously you have provincial archives. The provincial archives is really a crapshoot of what you're going to find because it really depends what the unions were told where they should put their files. Sometimes things are in city archives, sometimes they're at the archives of Ontario, sometimes they're at university archives. Dalhousie University did a lot of oral history projects through the 70s and 80s that concentrated on working class and sort of labor history. That was sort of a trend when recording equipment became more available. There was all these oral history projects. People wanted to go out and record them, which is great. But then at a certain point, funding for these things and interest in them sort of wanes. I mean, they don't totally go away. So I can't say that starting in the 90s, there were no oral history projects. That's not true. But if you kind of look through the collections, you'll see where there's a lot of files or interviews done and where there's gaps. And it's an interesting thing to think about because, unions are stronger here in Canada in comparison to the United States. There's, in a lot of places, more favorable labor laws at times in Canada in comparison to the United States. Yet when you look at the United States, some of their collections are really impressive. The collections out of the University of Washington, that's Washington State, really collective, really impressive collections. There's a collection in Detroit, a library. There's also the one that's the collection that's based out of Cornell University, and that's actually based out of their labor relations program. There's sort of a connection there, so it's sort of union files also with labor relations. So essentially, like the lawyers who were, on the company side, bargaining collective agreements and things like that. So when you look at the States, there's actually a lot more, which is interesting because you think of the States as being very anti-labor, which it has been, but there's this more basis of records when you start looking in comparison to Canada. Some of that is just, maybe it's an apples to oranges comparison, because if you're talking about a place like some of these big universities in the United States, like Cornell, it's one of the big universities, it's just, you're talking about tons more money and resources to be brought to bear, right, in comparison to Canada. But that is an interesting difference there. So where you're going to find labor collections, again, LAC will have it, but LAC, it has to be a national focus. So they will generally not take like unions that are more provincial. Let's say Manitoba Government Employees Union, they wouldn't probably take any of their records because it's not of a national focus. It's only in Manitoba, right? So they do have some stuff, and I know talking to the archivist there who deals with their labor records, there's some more recent records that they have. But once you get into the 90s, it becomes a little bit more sparse, and I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. Like I said, like funding is always an issue with archives, right? And especially with government, about things getting cut or different priorities, budget priorities as these things change, right? There's also probably backlogs, so who knows, there's probably things that are waiting to be processed that would be interesting for labor historians but have yet to be processed. And also another thing to consider is the unions themselves. A lot of the time, they don't really think too much about documenting their history. It's not something that a lot of organizations think about, especially unions. They're kind of thinking about the next rounds of bargaining they have to go through, their next political fights. That's where their minds are at, which makes total sense. But they don't necessarily thinking about, well, who's going to take our records and how should we preserve these things, right? Which is a common thing, as any archivist will tell you, from personal, just people themselves or organizations. But also to consider too, the political context and the economic context. The 90s were a really rough period for unions. I mean, you have free trade, NAFTA, there were mass job losses, total sectors were just kind of overturned and obliterated. If you look like with UFCW, they represent a lot of people within meatpacking. Well, through the 80s and the 90s, there were huge, like gigantic strikes that happened. Plants closed down, right? There used to be at one point in Winnipeg, in St. Boniface, the big stockyards, which is now just field now. It was all bulldozed, right? So you think about that as an archivist, you also have to take that into consideration. Like there was major upheaval within these organizations. So maybe stuff got lost, stuff got damaged, or they just really weren't thinking about it because they had far bigger fish to fry. So there's all those sorts of things that go into it in terms of what we have. But so that there is, like I said, there is stuff out there. You know, there's some universities, like I said, Dalhousie, there's some interesting collections there, and LAC. You will find some things at the University of, the provincial archives here in Manitoba. You know, if you start rooting around through Saskatchewan's or Alberta's databases, it's kind of tougher to find things that are like labor related. They'll have minister files, but not necessarily stuff from unions. So then it begs the question, well, where are these files? Where are they going? Which is why I think labor unions need to really fund their own independent archive, maybe a pan-Canadian archive to document and start holding these collections, because it's a noticeable thing. And just thinking a bit ahead, like if people are going to try to write histories, and of course there has been, but there's sometimes a lack of archival documentation, which I think is an issue for anybody. I mean, Stephen High in Montreal out of Concordia, I believe, has done some great work on deindustrialization. A lot of that's oral history, which is great, but I don't know how much archival stuff he was necessarily using that came from unions, right? So that's another thing to think about. So that's why, I mean, a lot of my concentration with my thesis is sort of about that unions have to take control of this, because no one else is going to do it. It's very unlikely that you're going to have some philanthropist billionaire who wants to build a labor archive. It's just probably not going to happen. And knowing unions, they'll have to put in those resources, but I think it's something of political advantage if they can have control of their archives and their history and use that for their own education purposes, and education and mobilization of their members. I think those things kind of go hand in hand. Of course, that's easier said than done, but I mean, doing a little bit of work with the unions, I mean, there certainly is money, I think, out there. I think it's just a matter of getting them to see what that can actually do for them, what documenting their history and their archives can do for them. Now, one thing too about labor union records, and something that I've been kind of working through with my thesis, is that, you know, it's not as if unions don't create records, they do. If you think about collective bargaining agreements, depending how long unions have been around, they'll usually have copies of those, and grievance files. So every, with shop stewards or union reps will be filing grievances fairly regularly. It depends on the workplace, but grievance, through a year, there'll be quite a bit of files. But when you think about the process, especially a collective bargaining agreement, I don't know if we're talking about here because of UMFA, but if you've ever in the strike there, but if you've ever looked at a collective bargaining agreement, I've looked at several, it's written in legalese. It's a totally other language. Certain things mean certain different things to a lawyer than they would to a lay person, right? And it's these huge documents that are quite complicated at times about pension formulations and all this other stuff. But the creation of something like a collective agreement, you're not going to get all that messy process that happened at the bargaining table. And that's where I think oral history comes in, because you'd have to go and interview the people. What was the bargaining like? What happened? I've done this for UFCW, where key bargaining sessions, I went and interviewed just shorter interviews with all of the, well, not all of them, but several of the people who were on the bargaining table through the process, like near the start of it, when they're in the middle of bargaining, and then at the end of bargaining. So there's a couple of those interviews I have in the UFCW collection that were done that kind of document what people's feelings were about what the issues were and why they were at the table and what the sort of the holdups were. So you'd need to do that. And of course, again, easier said than done. That's a lot of resources that it takes to do those sort of interviewing and do it well. And if you're thinking about starting to extrapolate that even for more than several unions in Canada, that's a ton of work, right? But it is something to think about and consider, because we have these documents like collective agreements, but it's hard to put a legal, like it's primarily used for legal reasons, very, very important legal reasons. And shop stewards and union reps will enforce the collective agreement in a workplace. But that document doesn't tell you this like human process that got you there. So that's where the oral history has to come in to kind of fill in those gaps. And, you know, and you know, you can, you know, and maybe it would be a matter of doing it more on a limited scale. Maybe you just interview a couple people, or you just handpick certain important collective agreements for someone to be interviewed about. And you want to do that, you know, sort of in the time that it's happening, because, you know, memories can kind of fade and maybe things can get mixed up. But that's sort of what my process and what my work is sort of on, is like thinking about these gaps we currently have in the labor records and the labor history here in Canada, and how would we actually do that? And then thinking through, like I was saying with the collective agreements, well, how do we, like, we have these documents, but they don't tell us the whole story. We need to go out and add in other information. And that's sort of, you know, what my focus is. And, you know, I think it's something that, again, like it's easy to say that, oh, we should just fund all this stuff. I understand it's a bit more complicated than that, but, you know, I think it's important to think about, you know, over the last 30 years, there's been some major important bits of history that have happened that, you know, might be harder to find in the archives, you know, or maybe my last comment is there's, like with a lot of the stuff with archives, there's probably stuff sitting in people's basements. I know in some unions, these groups of files for organizing just go with whoever has that position. So they'll just inherit these big boxes of files. So it's actually gone through several people's garages over the years. So it's like things like that I would identify as an archivist, like, okay, we need to have a place for this, because, you know, it could catch fire, there could be a leak, and then all this stuff gets destroyed, right? Like, you know, that's like, you know, thinking it's sort of what archivists always kind of worry about. It's like, oh God, what's going to happen to these things? But I think labor history is a thing that I think needs more attention in terms of Canadian history in general. So those are some of my thoughts and sort of my research and what I work on. So that's it for my time. I'll give it over to Jesse.
All right, thanks, Scott. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Let's see how this goes. Like Heather, it's been a few weeks since I've used Zoom, so automatically once it's my turn, I forget how to use Zoom, a mouse, and a keyboard. So I have to learn it all right now. Before I get into my presentation, I also wanted to thank Olivia for that land acknowledgement. It was really refreshing to hear a land acknowledgement that wasn't just a copy paste from the U of M's website. So thank you for putting a lot of effort into that. I very much appreciate it. So today I will be talking about rights, resistance, and how they are applied and represented in the NCTR archives. But before we get started, I wanted to go over, here we go. So before we get into the presentation, I briefly wanted to go over why we are here today. So we are here today because of you, because of the students. If we did not have this type of support from the students, I believe that we would not be in the position where we are right now in having such a large strike support, both in terms of the students and also as far as the number of UMFA members who are out on the picket lines and doing virtual picketing. So I just really wanted to thank all of the students for having our support in fighting for a fair deal to help issues around retention and ensuring that we can provide the best education possible for current and future students. So in my presentation today, I will be discussing how rights, and more specifically Indigenous rights, are interpreted and applied at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation Archives. I will also be providing examples of Indigenous resistance that can be found both within the NCTR archives and outside of our current holdings that bring into question what we should be collecting and why, and who should be involved in this important decision-making process. So this presentation will not focus on residential school history or the development of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, or the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So if anyone has any specific questions around that or would like additional information after the presentation, please feel free to reach out to me. But that being said, I did want to touch on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 17.2, that declares states shall, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, take specific measures to protect Indigenous children from economic exploitation and from performing any work that is likely to be hazardous or to interfere with the child's education or to be harmful to the child's health or physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development. So since other panelists are discussing issues around labor, I did want to briefly touch on the issues of forced labor at residential schools. UNDRIP Article 17.2 reads as a direct response to what occurred in Canada and other countries at residential and boarding schools. So at many of these institutions, often referred to as industrial schools, forced child labor was an integral part of the assimilation process, including the added benefit of the schools turning a profit around exports such as agriculture or handicrafts produced by the students. And from a practical standpoint as well, the residential schools used child labor for producing milk and food for the schools, as well as the girls would create clothing. So child labor was used to help keep the schools running and also save on costs around running the schools, maintaining the schools, and that sort of thing. If you would like to read more information on this, you can refer to the TRC's final report, Volume 1, Section 2, Chapter 14, which dedicates a whole chapter to this very topic. So UNDRIP Article 17.2 is key to ensuring working conditions around child labor, sometimes leading to death due to hazardous conditions, are never repeated. The first right that I want to highlight is the right to know. The right to know the truth and the right for individuals and communities to know what happened to them regarding gross human rights abuses, including in the context of residential schools, cultural genocide, the forceful removal of children, and the disappearance and mass burials of children at the schools. The TRC's calls to action 69 and 70 touch on archives and the adoption and implementation of both the UNDRIP as well as the United Nations Joine or Rentlicker principles. Among these principles are the following three that I will be discussing today. We have Principle 2, the inalienable right to the truth. Principle 3, the duty to preserve memory. And Principle 4, the victim's right to know. So providing access to survivors and community truths and colonial records is at the heart of the NCTR's mandate. And this ties directly to Principle 2, the right to the truth. So prior to the development of the NCTR and the document collection work of the TRC, Survivors and their family members had to request special permission to access residential school records in religious archives, and they had to know exactly where to look and who to ask for help. In government archives, microfilm reels of residential school records have been available for decades, but rendered inaccessible for most due to the difficult nature of navigating convoluted arrangement structures and poor descriptions tied to these records. And there are also issues similar to what Heather mentioned around in South Africa with the destruction of records. There were large groupings of records that were destroyed in Canada, whether malicious or not, leave huge holes within the documented colonial record of the residential schools in Canada. So at the NCTR archives, we've created a central repository where survivors and their families can gain access to all available records pertaining to their time at residential school. And we continue to actively collect new records from church and government archives to develop the most complete possible history of the residential school system in Canada, but more on that later. So principle 3, the duty to preserve memory. When the TRC's mandate ended in December of 2015, all documents collected or created by the TRC were transferred to the NCTR for long-term preservation and access. These records were transferred over from nearly 150 separate record repositories, totaling more than 4 million individual records. Now, this number changes as we continue to process this immense digital archive amassed by the TRC. And depending on the repository that provided the records, the level of detail describing the records varies from descriptions and metadata that follow standards and is very fulsome, which facilitates access, to records that came with no information, which require a great amount of work to understand its context as well as its content. So at the center, we work hard to fill in these gaps in these descriptions provided by church and government entities, but we always ensure that we are preserving all aspects of the memories and legacies related to the residential schools, which includes preserving both survivor accounts and colonial accounts, including propaganda and misinformation, as it speaks to the intent of those involved. This brings us to principle 4, the victim's right to know. The UN explains that irrespective of any legal proceedings, victims and their families have the imprescriptible right to know the truth about the circumstances in which violations took place, and in the event of death or disappearance, the victim's fate. Now, in September of 2019, the NCTR launched the National Student Memorial Register to honor the children who died at residential school. This was a direct response to the TRC's call to action 72 to build a student death register. These names were identified during the review of more than 1 million records collected by the TRC, as well as during a pilot project at the NCTR in 2018 to identify new records to be within scope of future research. To date, we have identified 4,127 children whose names were made public following months of engagement with Indigenous communities across the country. And since the launch of the register, many additional names have been provided by family members who lost someone at residential school. As many gaps exist in the colonial record held at the center, engaging with and learning from the knowledge held by communities is going to be vital in uncovering the truth behind missing children and unmarked burials in this country. So this brings us to the work that the center is doing today to both find the truth and disseminate this information in a way that is informative and educational, yet sensitive and respectful to the families left behind who still seek closure. We are currently working with an Indigenous research firm to review the remaining 2.3 million records in our archives, not previously included in the TRC's research. This will identify additional names and will identify additional information related to the already named students in the register, such as their home, community, cause of death, or location of burial. So for a very high percentage of the children who are listed on the register, the information around their death is very limited, such as their location of burial. I believe the location of burial is known in about 30% of the cases. Cause of death might be a little bit higher. And home communities, we've identified the home community of about 40% of the children. So the community engagement in bringing the names of these children home is going to be crucial in our work moving forward. So at this point in the presentation, the focus has been mainly on individual rights to information and the right to know. However, it is important to address collective or community rights to information pertaining to human rights abuses. As you can see on the screen, these are the communities in Canada affected by the residential school system. And more specifically, these are the home communities of the children who died at school. So, and due to recent events around unmarked burials at residential school sites like Kamloops, there has been an increased need for communities to gain access to records for research into student attendance, missing children, and unmarked burials. The NCTR Archives has several processes in place to facilitate access to records for survivors, intergenerational survivors, academic researchers, and the general public. However, it lacks a formal process for making large sets of public or non-public records available to communities. So in an effort to pivot and develop a process for providing large-scale access to records, the center is currently working with more than a dozen communities to first release batches of records in the hundreds via our proactive disclosure of records process, followed by a more complex and new process to facilitate community-based access to tens of thousands of records. This work is in its infancy. However, we understand the urgent need for more large-scale access for community-based research. And as such, we are quickly developing this remote community research portal that, paired with detailed memorandums of agreement between the NCTR and communities requesting the access, will facilitate such access. Now, this new process is very dynamic, and we continue to mold it in a way that best serves communities. And as we can continue to collect additional records from church and government repositories, we will work closely with communities to ensure they have access to these additional records to assist them in their search for truths regarding residential schools and their legacies. So this brings us to the final topic of my presentation on Indigenous resistance in archives. So records of resistance can be found in many record sets, such as colonial records documenting parents confronting RCMP officers and Indian agents apprehending their children, to survivor accounts of acts of resistance at school in the records created and collected by the TRC. They can also be found in accounts collected by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, or RCAP, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, the 60s Scoop Settlement, the Federal Indian Day School class action, the Idle No More movement, the Wet'suwet'en pipeline protest, and the list goes on. Indigenous peoples have been resisting colonialism since first contact, and archival collection mandates need to ensure that records associated with these events are being preserved for long-term access. The TRC, MMIWG, and RCAP had a document collection and creation component. However, these records are largely held and preserved by the very government that violated the rights of Indigenous peoples in the first place. Other forms of resistance, such as Idle No More and protests around pipelines and land resource conflicts, are often community-based or grassroots movements, making it more difficult to document and preserve in an archival context. Oops, wrong way. So because of this, many of the records documenting these events are confined to online social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, rather than being documented in tidy court documents or government reports. So on one hand, this provides firsthand accounts from the people on the ground grappling with these issues. However, it raises the following questions. Who should be documenting and preserving this information? Who owns this information? And who should have access moving forward? I don't have the answers to these questions today. However, now that the NCTR is working more closely with communities needing access to records for community-led research, it provides an opportunity to engage with communities to better understand their needs in terms of what information is important to them and what information should be preserved. UNDRIP Article 31.1 states that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expression. So in my mind, this article speaks directly to the idea of decolonizing archives, as it gives authority back to Indigenous communities when it comes to records documenting their lives in great detail, which should enable archival institutions such as the NCTR to think more critically at what records they are collecting and who should have its say in what is captured and where the information is housed. So whether the NCTR provides guidance in archival best practices to keep this information in community and help build archival capacity within community, or whether it acts as a steward for these records on behalf of communities as the owners of the information, one thing is very clear. Archives must do more to ensure future generations have access to documented resistance efforts as we continue to reconcile relationships between Indigenous peoples and settler society. Thank you very much for listening and for tuning in, and thank you again for all your support. It truly means everything.
Thanks for that, Jesse, Scott, and Heather. So I hope that today's panel has given all of you some insight into the incredibly important work that archivists like Heather, Scott, and Jesse are doing to protect human, labor, and Indigenous rights, and to document resistance to rights violations. As you have seen, this work is far removed from the kind of passive receiving and keeping of records that is an out-of-date stereotype of archives and archivists. Archives do not keep everything. Archivists build collections to meet specific community needs. As a country, Canada is always transforming and evolving, and so Canadian archives are always transforming themselves to continue to meet the needs of Canadian society. Since the work of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission began in 2009, the work of decolonization and reconciliation has become a top priority for archivists. This work demands that archivists be active in responding to the colonialism that has for too long been part of the operation of settler archives. Archival decolonization requires action on all aspects of archival work. To illustrate the kind of activist archivist that is required today, I will briefly explore some of the demands of archival decolonization. Settler researchers may find the reading rooms of archives to be places of calm, quiet research that brings its own rewards and pleasures. A typical visit to an archive for a settler researcher might include passing a security desk on their way to the reading room, ordering up some records, and then sitting for several hours reading and photographing the records. The work is calm, even meditative. For Indigenous researchers, the same reading room may be a place of trauma and surveillance. Providing identification before ordering up records can seem intrusive, especially when the records document historic or current traumas experienced by the researcher directly or by their family or community. And then reviewing these records under the watchful eye of archival staff. All of this is experienced very differently by Indigenous researchers than by settler researchers. Archives like the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation are building facilities that are intended to feel welcoming to Indigenous researchers and establishing protocols that are intended to support rather than surveil all researchers, including by having all staff be aware of the potential of the records to traumatize or re-traumatize, and having support staff on hand to help with research processes, and cultural support on hand to provide comfort and company. NCTR recognizes that conducting archival research is a burden for residential school survivors and prioritizes service to survivors in particular, conducting research on their behalf rather than requiring that they sift through the records themselves. Increasingly, other Canadian archives are adopting policies that similarly prioritize Indigenous researchers who want to access records about themselves, their families, or their communities. In many cases, these policies include having archival staff conduct initial research and providing digital copies of the relevant records without charge. All Canadian archives hold content about Indigenous peoples, but in most cases, these records were created by settler governments, academics, clergy, and so on, and not by Indigenous peoples themselves. These records are rarely the kinds of records that Indigenous communities would want created about them. Some go so far as to describe these records as toxic or dangerous. For many Indigenous communities, these records are themselves a source of misinformation and ongoing harm. In other words, it isn't just the reading rooms of archives that are in need of transformation, so are the collections. Going forward, activist archivists are needed who can do this work. The work of archival decolonization, however, is very different from the work of decolonizing a library or museum. Faced with racist, traumatizing books or museum exhibits, the first priority of a librarian or a curator is to stop the harm by removing the exhibits or stopping the books from circulating. Archives, however, are about so much more than just historical research. Archives also provide evidence of government malfeasance. They provide evidence of the harmful acts of institutions like universities, churches, and private corporations. This has been demonstrated very publicly through the work of inquiries such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Archival decolonization includes highlighting such problematic records, not removing them. In doing this work, archivists need to warn researchers of the nature of these records. Archival descriptions need to be rewritten with trigger warnings about racist, archaic language in the records, and with warnings of the specific misrepresentations they include. Equally, records that provide evidence of Canadian settler colonialism from the perspective of colonial bureaucrats and other settlers provide only a partial telling of the story that must be told. Activist archivists must seek out additional records that can contextualize colonial archives. In the case of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, essential contextualization of the records created by governments and churches is provided in the recorded testimony of residential school survivors. These records serve as a counterweight to the colonial archive. This kind of work must be done in many Canadian archives. Going forward, activist archivists must be ready to work with Indigenous communities and other communities misrepresented in their holdings, including racialized communities and 2S LGBTQIA communities, to identify appropriate counterweights that document historical traumas from the perspectives of community members, to contextualize records created by perpetrators, oppressors, and outside observers. Much of this work will be done by creating new oral histories. But before this can be done, archivists must explore their holdings to identify problematic record sets. Then they must build up relationships with affected communities. This work requires time, empathy, and dedication. It is the core work of activist archivists. Archives are sometimes represented paradoxically as vast storehouses of everything, or as random collections of bizarre and often trivial stuff. In reality, the highly selective and carefully built collections of archives reflect the terms of their mandates. Past archivists have worked diligently to document settler firsts and settler rights. Going forward, a new kind of archivist is needed who can recognize the partial and problematic nature of colonial archives and work to address these shortcomings. In a recent book, South African archival theorist Vern Harris has described all archives as haunted by those whose voices are denied a place in the archive. Archives in settler colonial societies play a central role in the assertion of settler rights over Indigenous rights. It is in the archives that so-called facts of colonization, such as the theft of Indigenous lands and its redistribution to settlers, are recorded, preserved, and protected. But since archives are central to colonialism, they are also central to decolonization. Activist archivists are needed. Archivists who understand that inclusive archives are central to achieving justice for Indigenous peoples and for anyone else who has been silenced and marginalized in Canadian society. Harris points out that transforming archives from sites of oppression to sites of liberation, from harm to healing, is not the quiet, safe work that some might imagine archivists to perform. In their different ways, all three of our panelists today have described this essential work of liberation. This is what students learn in archival studies by studying right here at the University of Manitoba. And that is why we desperately need to end the strike and get back to work. Heather and Jesse need to get back to the work of archival decolonization at the NCTR and at the U of M archives. And Scott needs to complete his degree and continue to create archives that support organized labor and labor rights. But we can't do that until our strike succeeds, until the provincial government butts out of our negotiations and UMFA is able to get a fair deal from the University of Manitoba. So with the rest of the panelists, I'd like to once again thank you for your support for the UMFA strike, and thank you for your time and attention today. I think we still have a few minutes left to take some questions if you have any. So I don't know, Olivia, did you want to manage the questions or?
I can, if people want to put questions into the chat,